Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. We're beginning The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe. I was born in York, England, in the year 1632. My father was not rich, but he had become well-to-do by trading. My elder brother had been killed in the war with the Spaniards, and the other had gone away from home and had never been heard from. Consequently, my father and mother wanted me to stay at home with them. But sad to say, I will be satisfied with nothing but going to sea. My desire for sailor's life led me so strongly against the will of my father that there seemed to be something fatal in my obstinacy, tending directly to the life of misery which was to befall me. One day, being at Hull, I met one of my companions, who was going by sea to London. He urged me so strongly to go with him that I consulted neither father nor mother, and in an ill hour on the 1st of September, 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London. This ship was no sooner out of the Humber than the wind began to blow, and the sea to rise in a most frightful manner, as I had never seen at sea before, and I was desperately sick in body and terrified in mind. I thought that every wave would swallow us up, and that every time the ship fell into the hollow of the sea, it would never rise again. In this agony of mind, I made many vows and resolutions that if I ever set my foot in dry land again, I would go directly home to my father and never venture forth to sea again as long as I lived. But the next day the wind went down and the sea grew calmer, and a fine evening followed. My seasickness and my fears disappeared, and with them all my thoughts of home and duty, as the great ship sailed on. I became more and more fascinated with sea life. The 6th day we came into Yarmouth roads. The wind had been contrary, and the weather so calm ever since the storm that we had made little headway. Here we were obliged to come to anchor. The wind continued variable, and on the 8th day another storm came up. To make matters worse, the ship sprung a leak. "All hands to the pumps," the captain cried. Our efforts, however, were useless. The vessel was doomed to sink. Guns were now fired as signals of distress, and a boat was put off to use from a nearby ship that had not been damaged because she was light. We had great difficulty in getting into the boat when it reached us, but we all managed to do so safely, and after several hours of drifting and constant fear of being swamped, we reached the shore drenched and destitute. At Yarmouth we were given some money, and I might easily have gone back to Hull, but my ill fate pushed me on. With what money I had, I made my way to London. There I fell in with the master of a ship bound for the coast of Guinea, on a trading voyage. He took a fancy to me, and at once we became friends. I raised some £40 by corresponding with my relations. This money I invested in trinkets such as the captain carried to trade with the natives. We then set sail and made a most successful voyage. The captain taught me to use the ship's instruments, and I became a navigator as well as a Guinea trader. My friend died soon after we returned to England, but I resolved to make the same voyage again on the same ship. This was a most unhappy trip, for though I left a good portion of my money with my friend's widow, yet I fell into terrible misfortunes. As our ship was making her course towards the Canary Islands, we were attacked by Moorish pirates. After a desperate fight, we were obliged to yield, and were all carried prisoner into Sallee, a port belonging to the Moors. I was sold as a slave and had to grind grain and dig in the garden. For 2 years I plotted and planned to escape, but was never successful. I was about to give up hope of ever being a free man again, when one day my master decided to take me on a fishing voyage with him, and at last my chance had come. As we were sailing past a deserted coast, I crept up behind the Moor and tossed him overboard into the sea. He rose immediately, for he swam like a cork, and begged to be taken in. As he continued to swim after us, I fetched a gun from the cabin and, pointing it at him, said, "You can swim well enough to reach the shore. If you try to get into this boat, I will use this." He turned about when he saw I was determined, and swam towards the shore, which I have no doubt he reached in safety. I then steered the boat straight out to sea. Luckily for me, I was picked up by a Portuguese ship. The captain listened to my story with sympathy and offered to take me to Brazil, whither he was bound. I shall never forget the generous treatment I received from the captain on that trip. He even paid me a good sum for the Moor's fishing boat so that I might have some money on hand when I landed. I soon learned that the planters of that country lived well and became rich, so I decided to stay there. When the Portuguese captain sailed, I sent by him an order for the money I had left with the English captain's widow. Later on, I bought a piece of land and raised sugar and tobacco. In a few years, I was prosperous and happy, and I often talked to the neighboring planters about my voyage to the coast of Guinea and told them how easy it was to trade with the natives, which were very dear in Brazil. One day, several of the planters came to me and said that they would fit our ship to go to the coast of Guinea if I would take charge of the affair. "There is nothing we need so much as your supplies," they said. Obeying the dictates of my fancy rather than my reason, I accepted and set sail the 1st of September, 1659, just 8 years from the day I first left home. We carried a cargo of toys and trinkets suitable for our trade, and such as beads, bits of glass, shells, looking-glasses, knives, scissors, and hatchets. For 12 days we had very good weather. Then a violent tornado overtook us. It blew in such a terrible manner that for 10 days we had no control of the ship, but went wherever fate and the fury of the waves directed. At last we perceived land ahead, but before we could make out whether it was an island or the mainland, the ship struck on the sand a long distance from the shore. We were now in a dreadful condition, and there was nothing to do but to think of saving our lives as best we could. One of our lifeboats had dashed against the ship's rudder and broken away. The other we managed to fling over the ship's side. All 11 of us crowded in, committing ourselves to God's mercy in the wild sea. The storm had abated considerably, yet the sea went dreadfully high upon the shore. We were working desperately at the oars and making nearer and nearer to land, when suddenly a great wave came rolling after us and upset the boat. We were all swallowed up in the moment. Nothing can describe what I felt when I sank into the water, for though I swam very well, yet I could not deliver myself from the waves so as to draw breath. I had been carried a vast way towards the shore when the wave, having spent itself, went back and left me upon the land almost dry. Seeing myself nearer the mainland than I expected, I got upon my feet and ran. Another wave soon overtook me, and then another, until I was dashed against a rock with such force that I was nearly senseless. I held on, however, until the wave receded, and the next run I took brought me to the mainland, exhausted and bruised. But I was now safe on shore, and began to thank God that my life was saved. I walked about, making 1,000 gestures and motions, which I cannot describe, to think that all my comrades were drowned, not one soul saved but myself, for I never saw any of them afterwards, and any sign of them except 3 of their hats and 2 shoes that were not mates. After looking at the barrenness about me, I began to realize that I had had a dreadful deliverance. There seemed to be no prospect before me but that of perishing with hunger, or being devoured by wild beasts. I had nothing with me but a knife, a tobacco pipe, and a little box of tobacco. The thought of having no other provisions threw me into terrible agonies of mind. I ran about like a madman. When I came to some fresh water, about a furlong from the shore, I calmed down and drank to my great joy, and then I put a little tobacco in my mouth to prevent hunger, and began to look about for a safe place to sleep, for night was coming on. I decided to get up in a tree, as I did not relish the idea of falling prey to ravenous beasts that might come out in the dark. I expected to stay awake all night, but nevertheless, I placed myself in a forking of the tree so that I would not fall if I had happened to go to sleep. I was so fatigued that I fell asleep immediately and did not wake up till it was broad daylight. The weather was clear and the sea calm. Imagine my surprise when I saw that the ship had been tossed up on the land about 2 miles from me. The swelling of the tide had lifted her off the sandbar, and the wind and the sea had driven her to shore in the night. I walked along the beach, but could not reach the vessel, as there was an inlet of water between the boat and myself, about half a mile broad. After waiting till the tide had ebbed so far out that I could come within a quarter of a mile of the ship, I swam out to her. When I reached the vessel, I did not know how to get on board, as she lay high out of the water. Her stern was lifted up on the bank, and her head low, almost to the water. I swam round for several times, and at last spied a rope hanging down the fore chains. With great difficulty, I got hold of it and climbed up into the forecastle of the ship. I found that the vessel was bulged and had a great deal of water in her hold. My joy was keen when I discovered that all the ship's provisions were dry and untouched by the water. I filled my pockets with biscuits and ate them as I went about other things, for I had no time to lose. There were some spare topmasts on board, and these I cut into 3 lengths and threw into the water. And then I went down the ship's side and tied them together at both ends with heavy rope. My raft was now completed and ready to load. First I laid all the planks or boards upon it that I could get, and then empty chests in which I had packed all kinds of provisions, such as bread, rice, 3 Dutch cheeses, 5 pieces of dried goat's flesh, some European corn, and several cases of bottled liquors. The most important thing was a carpenter's chest, which I did not take the time to look into, for I knew in general what it contained. My next care was for some ammunition and arms. I found 2 fowling pieces and 2 pistols, some powder horns, and 2 old rusty swords. I knew there were 3 barrels of powder in the ship, and with much search I found them. 2 of them were dry and good, and these I got to my raft with the arms. I also took ashore the ship's cat and dog, both of them half dead from hunger and thirst. The raft was now pretty well fitted, but how to get it back to shore was my next problem, as I had neither sail nor rudder. But, fortunately, the sea was no longer rough, and the tide was setting towards the shore. I found 2 or 3 broken oars, and with these I put to sea and landed at high tide, when the water covered the bank. When it receded, the raft was high and dry. I now began to view the country so as to seek the proper place for my habitation. About a mile from me there was a tall hill. Armed with a gun, 1 of the pistols, and a horn of powder, I traveled up to the top of the hill and discovered with dismay that I was on an island, surrounded on every side by sea. There was no other land to be seen except what appeared to be 2 small islands about 3 leagues to the west. Coming back to my raft, I fell to work, bringing my cargo on shore, which took me all the rest of the day, and the fear of wild beasts devouring me in the night still haunted me, so I barricaded myself round with the chests and boards that I had brought on shore, and made a kind of hut for that night's lodging. Next morning, I made another trip to the ship. I realized that the first storm that blew would break her all in pieces, and I had best lose no time in getting other things that I needed. I got on board the ship as before and made a second raft. Then I loaded it with 3 bags full of nails, spikes, a great screwjack, a dozen or 2 of hatchets, and grindstone. Besides these things, I took all the men's clothes that I could find, a spare foretop sail, a hammock, some bedding, 2 or 3 iron crows, 2 barrels of musket bullets, and 7 muskets. During my absence from shore, I had half expected that my provisions would be devoured by wild beasts, but on my return I found no sign of any such visitors. On one of these chests, however, sat a creature that resembled a wild cat. At my approach she ran away a little distance, then sat very still and stared at me in rather a friendly way. I tossed her a bit of biscuit, which she smelled and then ate. She looked so pleased that I would have given her more had I not suddenly realized that my food supply was limited. Finally, she marched off. As soon as I had carried my second cargo up on land, I went to work to make a little tent out of the sail and some poles, which I cut for that purpose. I then carried into the tent everything that I knew would be spoiled either by rain or sun. The empty chests and casks I piled in a circle round the outside of the tent to fortify it from any sudden attempt from man or beast. I blocked up the door with some boards within, and spreading some of the bedding upon the ground, lay down to sleep with my guns beside me. I slept very quietly all night, and next morning was ready for another trip to the abandoned ship. As long as the vessel stood upright in that posture, I thought I ought to get everything out of her that I could. So every day at low water, I went on board and brought away such things as rigging, rope, twine, and all of the sails, which, of course, I had cut into pieces. There was a pleasant surprise in store for me when I found a great hogshead of bread, a box of fine sugar, and a barrel of flour. The last time I went on board, I brought away some pieces of cable and all the ironwork that I could move. If it had remained calm, I believe I would have eventually cut up the whole ship and taken it ashore. But one night it blew very hard, and next morning the ship was no longer to be seen. And we will continue this story next Friday or Saturday. If you were in Robinson Crusoe's position, do you think you could survive? Thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.